My name doesn't matter as much as what I do for a living, because what I do is the only reason I am still standing here today with my daughter in my arms. I am a forensic auditor. For nearly 8 years, I have made my living hunting financial lies. The kind buried inside spreadsheet formulas and offshore wire transfers, the kind that corporations build entire floors of lawyers around to protect. I thought I was good at reading people. I thought 31 years of life and almost a decade tracking financial predators had given me a kind of immunity to deception. I was wrong about that, but only for a little while. The morning everything changed. My husband and I were sitting in the waiting room of the adoption agency on King Street West in Toronto. We had been on the domestic infant adoption waitlist for 14 months. 14 months of home studies and background checks and character references and waiting. The worst kind of waiting, the kind where you check your phone every hour in case something has changed. 3 weeks earlier, we had been matched with a baby girl. A newborn, 7 pounds 4 ounces, born to a young mother in Kitchener who had made the bravest and most heartbreaking decision I have ever witnessed. We were supposed to be reviewing the final paperwork that morning, the placement agreement, the first step toward bringing her home. I stepped out of the meeting room to get a cup of water from the dispenser in the hallway. The corridor was empty and quiet, the kind of hush that government offices and law firms always have, like the walls themselves are listening. My husband was standing at the far end of the hall with his back to me, his phone pressed to his ear. I almost called out to him. Then I heard what he was saying and my hand went still on the paper cup. "She doesn't need to know the timeline," he said quietly. "Just make sure the placement file gets flagged. Tell them the birth mother changed her mind. By the time my wife figures out what happened, the window will have closed and there'll be nothing left to appeal." I did not move, I did not breathe. He laughed softly at something the other person said. "She'll be devastated, obviously. But she'll get over it, she always does." The paper cup crinkled in my fist. I walked back to the women's washroom at the other end of the hall. I ran cold water over my wrists the way my mother taught me when I was small and my anxiety was large. I looked at my face in the mirror. The woman looking back at me had spent the last year imagining a nursery, choosing a name, folding tiny onesies into a dresser so we had painted white together. She had believed genuinely and completely that her husband wanted this as much as she did. That woman was still there, but something had shifted behind her eyes. I dried my hands and went back to the meeting room. I sat down beside my husband and smiled at the caseworker and signed the documents she placed in front of me. My husband reached over and squeezed my hand. I let him. Let me explain who he is, because this story does not make sense without understanding what I married. My husband came from a family that had spent 2 generations building the kind of wealth that looks effortless from the outside. A property management company based in Mississauga, a summer house on Lake Muskoka, the right memberships, the right schools. He was charming in the way that people who have always gotten what they want are charming. He smiled with his whole face. He was generous with money and affectionate in public. He said all the right things about partnership and equality and how proud he was of my career. What he never said, at least not to me, was that his company was quietly collapsing. I found out that night. He went to bed early, claiming a headache. I waited until his breathing settled into the slow, even rhythm I knew meant deep sleep. Then I went to his home office on the 2nd floor of our house in Etobicoke, and I sat down at his desk and I started reading. I am very good at reading. The official company books were immaculate, clean revenue lines, modest operating costs, a picture of modest and steady success. But I have built my career on the gap between what the books say and what actually happened. And my husband had made the amateur's mistake of keeping everything on one laptop with one password I had watched him type 300 times. The real picture was catastrophic. He had invested heavily in a restaurant group venture 2 years earlier, 4 locations across the GTA, the kind of farm-to-table concept that had exploded during the post-pandemic recovery and then contracted just as fast. 2 locations had already been shuttered. The remaining 2 were hemorrhaging cash. He owed $580,000 to a group of private lenders he had found through a broker. The kind of arrangement that falls entirely outside the regulatory oversight of the major banks, with compounding interest rates and consequences written in language that left very little room for interpretation. The most recent message in his inbox from 2 weeks ago was a single line. Deadline is end of Q4. Non-negotiable. Q4 ended in 3 months. I sat back in his leather chair and stared at the ceiling. Then I kept reading. It took another hour to find the connection I was looking for because he had hidden it carefully, routed through a numbered company registered in Alberta that held a single asset, a $12,000 retainer payment to a private adoption consultant named in a forwarded email chain. The consultant's name matched the name of the paralegal at our adoption lawyer's office who had processed our home study. And the email chain, when I read it from beginning to end, explained everything. My husband's sister had been trying to get pregnant for 6 years. She and her husband, a man from a wealthy family in the Niagara region, had been through 3 rounds of IVF and 2 failed surrogacy arrangements. What I had never known, because my husband had very deliberately never told me, was the financial dimension beneath the fertility struggle. My brother-in-law's grandfather had died 18 months ago, leaving behind a $19 million estate. The will, drafted by a traditional family solicitor in St. Catherine's, stipulated that the primary inheritance would pass to my brother-in-law only upon the arrival of a direct or legally adopted child. The deadline was tied to the 3rd anniversary of the grandfather's death, which was now 16 months away. Without a child, my brother-in-law would receive a token inheritance, and the remainder would pass to 2 charitable foundations. Without the $19 million, the family's real estate holdings in Niagara-on-the-Lake, already leveraged against the anticipated inheritance, would default. My husband had found the solution: our adoption, our daughter. The plan, as I pieced it together from the email chain, was simple and brutal. The placement file would be flagged on a technicality, a paperwork error, a miscommunication with the birth mother's representative. The placement would collapse. My husband would console me. Several months later, in a parallel process I would never be told about, my sister-in-law and her husband would complete a private adoption through a separate agency facilitated by the same consultant, using documentation already quietly prepared. In exchange, my brother-in-law would wire $400,000 to a numbered account my husband controlled. Enough to cover the private lenders and keep the restaurant venture alive until the assets could be sold. They were going to take my daughter before I had ever held her. I did not cry. I reached into the desk drawer, found a USB drive my husband used for backing up project files, and I plugged it in. I spent the next 2 hours copying everything. The following weeks were the strangest of my life. I went to a forensic IT specialist I had worked with on a corporate case, someone I trusted entirely, someone completely outside my husband's world, and I had the USB contents verified and authenticated. I contacted a former colleague who had left the provincial government and now ran a private investigations firm, and I asked her, without explaining everything yet, whether she had contacts at the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit. She said yes. I told her I would be in touch. At home, I was a perfect wife. I bought a crib, I folded onesies, I asked my husband about nursery colors and listened to him talk about weekend plans and did not let a single flicker of what I knew cross my face. My mother-in-law arrived on a Thursday, 2 weeks before the placement date. She showed up with 2 large suitcases and a smile so wide it looked borrowed. She announced she wanted to be there for the transition period, to help with meals and to support us through the early days. My husband looked delighted. I looked grateful. She was there to watch me. I understood that the moment she started asking, very casually, about my work schedule, about whether I would be checking in with my firm often, about whether I had been resting enough, because stress was very hard on new parents, and perhaps I should take my leave earlier than planned. On the 3rd day, she set a small amber bottle on the kitchen counter beside my coffee. No pharmacy label. A strip of masking tape with my initial written in blue pen. She said the family doctor had recommended a specific supplement formulation, something about cortisol regulation and iron absorption, and my husband had picked it up for me. I was not pregnant, I was adopting. There is no supplement a doctor prescribes for an adoptive mother 3 weeks before placement. I palmed the capsule she shook out for me, swallowed a mint from my pocket, and held up my water glass so she could see my throat move. That afternoon, while she was on the phone in the other room, I took the capsule to the kitchen table and broke it open. I am a forensic auditor, not a toxicologist, but I know how to photograph evidence and I know who to call. My contact at the investigation firm had the contents analyzed within 48 hours. The capsule contained a combination of herbal compounds used in high concentrations to induce uterine cramping, and in a woman under prolonged stress, The likely effect was a documented anxiety episode or physical symptoms severe enough to raise questions with an adoption caseworker about placement readiness. If I seemed unstable, the agency could delay or cancel the placement on their own. They were trying to manufacture a reason to take my daughter before she even came home. I replaced the remaining capsules with plain vitamin C tablets. I took one every morning in front of my mother-in-law, smiling, thanking her for thinking of me. Before it was like this, I want to tell you about the family dinner. My sister-in-law and her husband drove up from the Niagara region on a Saturday evening. We sat in my in-laws' house in Oakville around a table set with the good china, and I watched my husband and his family celebrate what they believed was their coming victory over a lamb roast and a very expensive bottle of Niagara Peninsula Red. My brother-in-law was not a subtle man. He was the kind of person who had grown up in a house where money made you right by default, and that certainty had a way of leaking out after the second glass of wine. He asked me, across the table, with what I think he intended as warmth, whether I was handling the emotional side of adoption. All right, given how these situations can fall through at the last minute. I said I was feeling hopeful. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they already know the ending of a story. Resilience, he said, that's the key. You build your capacity for disappointment and then life surprises you. My sister-in-law looked at the tablecloth. My mother-in-law refilled everyone's water glasses. I smiled and said, I completely agree. Later, after dessert, my brother-in-law excused himself to take a call on the back porch. I volunteered to bring him his coffee. He was standing near the railing with his phone to his ear, and he lowered his voice when he saw me, but not quite enough. The placement gets flagged next Thursday, he said. The consultant confirmed it. By the time anyone appeals, we're already in the other process. Tell your father it's handled. I set his coffee on the railing. He thanked me without making eye contact. I went back inside and helped clear the dishes. The baby shower was held at a private event space in Burlington the following weekend. My sister-in-law had insisted on organizing it. The room was all cream linen and eucalyptus, and a 5-tier cake that cost more than my first car. Among the guests were my mother-in-law's country club friends, my brother-in-law's business associates, and a scattering of my husband's investors who had apparently received invitations before I had finalized the guest list myself. My own friends were sparse. I had been told with great warmth that the venue had a capacity limit. My sister-in-law held court near the gift table in a designer dress and heels, entirely unsuitable for a Saturday afternoon. She was telling a group of my mother-in-law's friends about the night nurse she had already hired. Fully certified, 5 years of newborn experience, starting availability in 4 weeks. One of the women turned to me with a kind smile. Oh, are you using the same service? Before I could answer, my sister-in-law stepped smoothly forward. We thought we'd help out a lot in the early days. It really does take a village, and with such a big adjustment period, extra hands make such a difference. She glanced at my stomach, then caught herself and looked away. She was talking about my daughter. She had hired a night nurse for my daughter. I took a sip of sparkling water. My brother-in-law found me near the gift table about an hour later. He had started on the scotch. I could smell it when he leaned down to say something in my ear, his hand resting heavily on the table beside me. You know, he said, his voice low and loose with drink, I want you to know that whatever happens, this family takes care of its own. My grandfather built something lasting and it has to keep going. You understand that, right? Legacy. It has to go somewhere. I looked up at him. I understand completely, I said. He nodded, satisfied. Then, because the alcohol had made him honest, 19 million reasons to get this right. He tapped the table once, almost to himself, and walked back toward the bar. Everything he said was recorded on a device clipped to the inside of my blazer. That night, I sent my contact at the investigation firm a single message. I have enough. I need RCMP Financial Crimes and the Provincial Adoption Oversight Office. Can you arrange Monday? She replied within 10 minutes. Already made some calls. You're not the first complaint against that consultant. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and let myself feel for just a moment the full weight of what had been done. Not the legal architecture, not the strategy. Just the grief of it. The 14 months on a waitlist, the home studies, the character references, the careful and hopeful accumulation of a life prepared for a child. And a man sleeping 8 feet away from me who had looked at all of that and seen a transaction. Then I put it away. There was still work to do. Monday's meeting was in a glass-walled office near Bay Street. The investigator from RCMP Financial Crimes listened without interrupting. The representative from Ontario's Child and Family Services Oversight Office took notes in a narrow legal pad. I laid out the USB documentation in the order I had organized it: the numbered company, the retainer payment, the email chain, the estate timeline, the wire transfer history, the private lender agreements with my husband's forged income representations. When I finished, the RCMP investigator said, "Ma'am," and I stopped him. "Tell me what happens next," I said. What happened next took 11 days. The placement was not flagged. The paralegal at the adoption lawyer's office was contacted by the oversight office. Before she had the chance to file anything, the consultant's license was suspended pending investigation. My husband received a call from the Financial Crimes Unit on a Tuesday morning while he was eating breakfast in our kitchen, and I watched his face from across the table as he realized, in real time, that the walls had been there all along. He had simply been standing on the wrong side of them. He looked at me, I looked back. "I can explain," he said. I picked up my coffee and said nothing. The charges were filed within the week: wire fraud, conspiracy to commit adoption fraud under the Child, Youth and Family Services Act, breach of fiduciary duty to private creditors using falsified income documentation. The consultant faced her own charges through a separate referral. The private lending group, operating well outside FINTRAC registration requirements, was referred to a parallel financial crimes investigation. My brother-in-law's estate claim was flagged by the grandfather's estate lawyers once the fraud charges became public record. The foundation trustees launched their own legal challenge. He lost the inheritance before the case went to trial. The Niagara properties went into receivership in November. My sister-in-law called me once, from a number I didn't recognize, about 6 weeks after everything became public. I let it go to voicemail. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't understood the full scope of what her husband had arranged with my husband. She said she hoped I could understand what desperation feels like. I deleted the message. I understand desperation very well. I spent 14 months on a waitlist. I painted a nursery. I folded onesies and sat across from people who were counting on my grief to blind me, and I smiled and I kept my receipts. The adoption was finalized on a Friday in February. The courthouse hallways smelled like the coffee cart near the elevator, and the judge had kind eyes and mispronounced my daughter's name once before getting it right. I was alone at the respondent's table. My lawyer sat beside me. My colleague from the investigation firm sat in the gallery and cried, which she would later deny completely. I carried my daughter out of the building in a snowsuit the color of new leaves. She is 4 months old now. She sleeps in the white dresser room in Etobicoke. In the crib I assembled myself one Sunday afternoon with a YouTube tutorial and a stubbornness my mother always said was my best and most inconvenient quality. The house is quieter than it used to be in some ways and louder in others. I went back to work part-time last month. My firm promoted me to senior investigator before my leave ended. Someone asked me recently whether I was angry, whether the betrayal had broken something permanent. I thought about it honestly before I answered. What I know is this: the people who try to use your love as a lever against you are counting on the fact that love makes you soft. They think that if they position themselves close enough to what you care about most, you will protect the feeling instead of the person. They underestimate how clearly you can think when the stakes are your whole life. I find what people hide. I follow the money and I follow the lies, and I build cases from the smallest details. A payment routed through a numbered company, a phone call overheard in an empty hallway, a capsule that doesn't match its label. They forgot who I was. That was their only real mistake. My daughter is asleep in the next room. Outside the window, the February light is doing that particular thing it does in Ontario, when the temperature drops and the sky goes completely white and the whole city looks like it was built inside a snow globe. I make myself a cup of tea, I sit by the window, I watch the light. We are going to be just fine.